Hello and welcome to Listen.Up.People, a podcast of the USC Suzanne Dworak-Peck School of Social Work. I'm Dr. Eric Rice, professor and associate dean for research. Around the globe, an estimated 27 million people are exploited for labor, services, and commercial sex. Traffickers prey on some of the world's most marginalized and vulnerable individuals, profiting from their plight. This crisis affects both men and women, boys and girls. My guests today have dedicated their careers to preventing and combating human trafficking with a vision of eradicating trafficking in all of its forms. It's my pleasure to introduce today my two colleagues, Dr. Annalisa Enrile, teaching professor, and Dr. Holly Priebe Sotelo, associate teaching professor of practicum education. We at the School of Social Work are so fortunate to have this formidable pair of anti-trafficking warriors educating the next generation of social work leaders at our school. It's great to have you both here.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
I like to start these episodes off with a personal question, which is, how did you get interested in doing this particular kind of work? And maybe I'll turn to Annalisa first and then Holly. But Annalisa, human trafficking, why did you get involved in this work?
So I've actually been working on human trafficking even before we were calling a lot of the things that we're calling trafficking now trafficking. In 1993, I was an undergraduate student and I was at an event, a women's conference event, and two of the speakers were mail order brides in one workshop, and two of the speakers were former garment workers that had been enslaved in Saipan. And just hearing their stories and listening to them talk about their lives as they were so, when they started and when they were trafficked, were so close in age to what I was. I just thought, like, this is going to be what I am committed to forever, no matter, what happens. And it just so happened, that I stayed in academia. And as a social worker, I think what's really beautiful about our field is that we can work in so many different capacities. I always say, like, the whole continuum of trafficking, I have experienced, work in those areas. It seems so daunting. It grows bigger and bigger, but that's always because we are learning more and more about it. But that's really how I started.
Holly, what about you? How did you get interested in doing this kind of work?
Thank you, Eric. And I just want to start by saying I'm so honored to be sharing this podcast with you both. Annalisa is truly a warrior. I started, as a social worker in 1991, 92 at DCFS LA County. And similar to what Annalisa said, is that we were doing this work before we knew it was called CSEC or sex trafficking. We didn't call it that. This is a fairly new term within the last 25 years. But as a social worker for LA County, I remember having cases working with families who were selling young children to keep their lights on, to sustain their drug habits. Then fast forward, working in the school district at LA Unified School District for 16 years, doing violence prevention work, crisis response work. I was approached by our police chief, Chief Zipperman, and I think it was 2014, when he said, Holly, what are we doing in the schools about human trafficking? And I paused for a really long time and I said, I don't understand what you mean. We don't have human trafficking in schools. And so very quickly, I was educated by some real warriors. These are the real people on the ground, that Michelle Guymans of the world, and a number of experts that came forward and educated me on what was happening in our schools under our noses, that young people were being trafficked out of our schools. And so right away, I, put together a task force in the school district, even before there were laws to do that. And from there, this movement of prevention in schools has really been my passion, is really making sure that we educate young people and their parents about what this is and how to protect kids. So that's how in a very short summary, how I got involved. But thank you.
Amazing, amazing. I'm struck that both of you said before we called it human trafficking. Maybe a place for us to start this conversation is to just say, what are we talking about when we say human trafficking? Maybe Annalisa, you can start off with kind of how you conceptualize it, and then Holly, you could maybe add to it if there's more, because I'm sure there will be. So Annalisa?
I think that the definition of human trafficking, like I said earlier, is one of the things that we're getting better and better at understanding the nuances. So,
Mhm.
20 years ago, we talked about, issues of coercion and didn't include things like poverty, which, Holly was alluding to. And now we recognize that people who are living in extreme poverty have very limited choices. So this could be considered a form of coercion. I think like the official definition is something around recruitment, transport, harboring, of persons, exploitation for, where fraud, coercion, force has occurred, and usually for the purposes of commercial sexual exploitation, or labor. But we also see in many countries, especially underdeveloped countries, the trafficking of human organs. So that is, I also see that as part of human trafficking as well.
Wow. Holly, do you want to add to that since you were just talking about how much you want to educate families about these issues?
Yes, thank you so much. And to add to Annalisa's comments, we know now that there's factors that create more risk, that puts populations at risk. So again, we used to think about it as something overseas, but what we know is that, again, poverty is a very common denominator for many of the families or victims or survivors. Histories of child sexual abuse, history where their ACEs obviously are adverse childhood experiences, put families at a significant risk of being trafficked, because when you're trying to determine, how do I feed my children? How do I keep my lights on? How do I pay my rent or my mortgage, etc.? These are things where people are in survival mode and will do almost anything to stay alive. So we know that there are some common denominators that we need to help our families to stay out of being recruited or knowing what it looks like. There's some other elements like in schools where we know where we can help people do simple things, connecting with young people, asking what's happened to them, being more trauma informed about, our work, that perhaps maybe young people are behaving in such a way because there's a history, there's some trauma that needs to be uncovered. And so these are some, and then substance abuse and homelessness. And so all these things that are contributing to why people fall into the trap of human trafficking.
Something you said just like triggered something for me as well, in terms of, we want to have these really simple definitions. And I
Mhm.
think that what is very difficult, especially about sex trafficking, is that there are these shades of gray. So in many countries, the United States included, we've tried to say, oh, there's this, at 18 and below for sure, that's sex trafficking. And then it becomes a little bit hazy. But even to get, that classification of trafficking for children was a very, very difficult fight for the anti-trafficking movement, because of, this idea that, sex is something that it can be transactional. And so it was very difficult convincing people about all of the things that Holly has mentioned that can be considered or should be considered a form of coercion. I mean, even today, it is a debate amongst people whether or not trauma really plays a role in what we think of as true choice. And so sometimes it's really frustrating coming from a background of what we know as social workers, especially around mental health and what trauma does, because it's you've got to go 5 steps back when you start this education, and oftentimes it doesn't fit nicely into a box. And so that is where I think a lot of the challenges have been in this space.
And you know what,
Yeah.
can I just add something?
Of
Sorry,
course, please.
Eric. I just, you also triggered something else for me, Annalisa, where most people who are involved or most victims don't see themselves as victims. They go through this lifespan of thinking that they have somehow consented, or maybe it was their fault. And so there's so much shame associated, the stigma associated with it, that they defend themselves sometimes to say, no, I consented, even though we know in California, minors are not able to consent until they're 18 years old. But so there's this debate about people are out there on the track, or they're participating. This is their livelihood, and leave them alone. They're making a living. And so there's that debate as to whether or not, is this a crime? Are they consenting? And so that's half of the battle when you talk to people that are not in our field of social work, is that they just can't get their heads around. It's like, wait, if they're on the street, or if they're doing this, can't they just leave? Why don't they go? Why? Right? So
Yeah,
that's the
yeah.
big debate, is they don't, a lot of times they don't see themselves as victims. So this vicious cycle continues. So that's part of the problem too.
Absolutely. I mean, I know probably both of you know that I do a lot of work with young adults and teenagers who are experiencing homelessness. And, I certainly am not an expert in the field of trafficking, but I know that this bleeds into the space that I study. And I certainly have seen what you're talking about, which is, young people that are engaged in commercial sex work or transaction sex, and they wouldn't define themselves necessarily as trafficking victims, but their freedom of choice is not something that I would necessarily say is very strong. And but you also don't want to necessarily tell people that they don't have freedom of choice, right? I mean, I think it's a very fine line about supporting folks as well. And I think one of the things that I was really interested in as a follow-up to this question really is, Annalisa, you have said sometimes that there's a normalization of transactional relationships that you think has contributed to this problem. Can
Mhm.
you maybe speak to what it is that you mean by this? What is a transactional relationship, and what does it mean that it's become so normalized in our
Mhm.
global culture?
Yeah, thanks. That's such a great question. I think there's a normalization through social media, especially in on TikTok, and also through, reality TV, where you get into relationships, and part of the function of a intimate relationship, a romantic relationship, is this idea of gifts, experiences. I mean, there's like this whole viral thing on TikTok about, like, he doesn't really love you if he takes you to Cheesecake Factory. I mean, it's like, ridiculous kinds of things like that. And this idea that, okay, it's something that I can trade my time, my sexuality, my sex acts, in order for things. And what happens then is, because it's normalized, there is then this narrative that I think those kids who are involved in survival sex, where they are trading sexual favors for a night on someone's couch, or if they have been, like Holly said, trafficked but don't want to admit that they're trafficked. I mean, I don't think that it is a coincidence that, especially in the United States, when we look at girls who are domestically trafficked, or youth in general that are domestically trafficked, a more large majority of them are trafficked by Romeo pimps, what we call Romeo pimps, which is, traffickers who have convinced them that they are in a relationship and that they love this person. And the only reason that they are asking them to engage in commercial sexual acts is because, they need money to support both of them. It's just temporary. You're my favorite. Even, they can have multiples, and still find a way to rationalize that. And I think that that is very much mirrored in a lot of mainstream culture in certain ways. And even if it's not, these kinds of viral trends, if you go like to any high school, and many high schools are actually making this, are disallowing this, like dance proposals, promposals, where these very elaborate kind of proposal scenarios occur. Torrance High School is a good example. This was a couple of years ago. They've outlawed these promposals because a couple of years ago there was a promposal that was done on social media. They streamed it live, where the boy gave the promposal along with $900 in cash on this signboard, and the girl said yes. And then there was this debate, in the comments, like, oh, I guess you can buy a prom date now. And all these kids were like, yeah, yes,
Mm.
yes, like, hands up. I'm not going to be sold for less than 1,000. And that was the language, that they were using. And as youth get older, I have heard of sororities in college using sugar babying sites as ways to raise raise money for their sorority. So, this idea that sex work is a plausible form of work and not exploitation, I think is very much popularized. It is one of the big debates that, that Holly has mentioned. And what it does is it really kind of muddies this question around human trafficking and sex
Mhm.
trafficking. And if you look at like who is really fueling a lot of that debate and discussion on sex work, there's a lot of other interests and other beneficiaries, namely the porn industry, that is benefiting from this type of, well, some of it should be legal.
Yeah.
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
And Holly, these comments that Annalisa made about us, about kids in high schools really brings me back to some of the work that you've done and alluded to. And I know you've said that oftentimes people that are being human trafficked are hidden in plain sight, and that you want people to be aware of how to even understand or identify a potential human trafficking situation. Can you maybe give our listeners a little bit of an understanding so that we can be a bit more proactive about this situation that Annalise has been talking to us about?
Yeah, a few points. So hidden in plain sight, it really helps to open our eyes that the person right next door to us perhaps is being engaged or is being trafficked. And I'll give an example. There's a video that I use about a young lady who was being trafficked. She was 15 years old when she met her trafficker on Instagram because they liked each other's tattoos. So I showed this video for the purpose of demonstrating how recruitment, how easy it happens, how quickly it can grow. So this video that I showed in class when I was doing a workshop or training, and lo and behold, at the end of the training, two of the participants in my class said, Holly, we know that person. She was our next door neighbor. And we never knew that she was being trafficked. We always just said in the community, she's a slut. She was loose. She had many boyfriends. We just all judged her. That's an example of the fact that right next door to them, and they were social work students who said this. They didn't know, but the community had ostracized her. So I say this because oftentimes people who are actively being trafficked are attending our schools. They're in our supermarkets. They're in our hospitals. We know about like 85% of people who are being trafficked visit emergency rooms, and usually their pimp is right with them. Pimp meaning their trafficker is standing right with them, oftentimes not allowing their girl or whoever not to speak. So there's a number of trainings of ways that we can make people that are working in what we would consider, just public facing types of jobs, whether you're delivering mail, whether you're bagging groceries at a tattoo parlor, wherever you are, you might be encountering a victim of human trafficking right under your nose. And so if we could just help people recognize what are some of the red flags, what are some of the questions that you might be able to ask. I did a training not too long ago in New Mexico last month where we were training 47 hospitals, their administrators and ER workers about what does it look like when a trafficker brings in someone, and then what questions might you be able to ask. Again, to answer your question about hidden in plain sight, they're everywhere. They're not just like what the movies might think that they're hidden in a basement. They're not hidden always in a basement. They are out in plain sight, and we need to be able to recognize that.
And I think one of the things that's great, as Holly's mentioned, is the kind of front line against trafficking are all these people that are like the first point of contact, the people that are working in stores, and people that are nail technicians, people that are hairdressers, people that are, emergency room nurses, hotel workers, so trainings, for example, for hotel workers, if you are like at the front desk of a hotel and you're checking someone in who is, wearing like some booty shorts and a sports bra, and it's raining and freezing outside, that's a red flag. if there's no luggage, if the person that's checking them in is, extremely older than them, and especially like if you see one or both of them leave without the other, all of these are very easy tells. And I think that there's just brave frontliners out there. But if we could give them that information that Holly is describing, it arms them with the ability to, call the authorities and say, I think this is happening, because of these types of red flags. I think some other red flags could be you see an uptick, right, in trafficking whenever there's events. See, we always talk about like major athletic events, but any events, like for example, one of the big tracks, which is where we see a lot of, what we call areas where we see a lot of sex trafficking activity happening, is on Figueroa, right down the street from USC. And during graduation week, like during the month of May, it is so busy and congested in that area. Anyone driving down there can see that those tracks are full. And it doesn't take a huge red flag to notice that some of the folks on the street are very, very young, could not possibly be 18. And so I think there's a lot of flags that are out there that we have to be trained to see. And I think there's also a lot of things that we don't want to see. Your story that you shared, Holly, is so touching because it's a lot easier to malign than it is to say, I wonder what's going on there. Why is that a different person every time I see them? Why are we talking about this person in this way as opposed to just us making assumptions?
It would be remiss if we didn't mention the New York Times article that was just published October 26th that talked about young girls being trafficked on Figueroa Street. And there's a sentence here. It says, the Blade, which is what they call it, or the kiddie troll. The Blade was an 8-minute drive from the University of Southern California and yet another universe. So right down the street from our own university, we have human trafficking happening in broad daylight. It is not unusual to drive down the street to see young girls on the street in just very, like you mentioned, it could be so cold outside, raining, and they're almost half naked, and it feels like the whole community has turned a blind eye, which is a whole nother topic in and of itself when we talk about the laws that have recently changed that have made it really, really difficult for law enforcement to do their job. And so that has also really debilitated us as a society to properly provide resources to get young people off the streets, to get them their resources. So that's a whole nother debate as well that needs to be addressed at some point.
Just kind of listening to us, I always think about like, God, this is a black hole. How are we going to ever find ourselves out of it? How can we stay even a step ahead? One of the ways that I've been able to keep working on this issue is to also focus on like the amazing work that people are doing and really the innovation that is happening to fight, not just sex trafficking, but also, labor exploitation and trafficking, especially in these times. Try to do something that will make an impact. So.
Well, this is actually exactly what I wanted to ask as a follow-up, and I would love to ask this of both of you, which is, it is such a huge problem. Holly's just alluded to the fact that there are some legal changes that have made it even more difficult. What is it that you as social work educators and social workers are encouraging people to do, and how is it that social work is entering the fray? I mean, I'm sure there's a thousand different things, but maybe you can talk about a couple of things that you think are the most important that folks are engaging in.
I think for starters, I think people need to be educated voters, period. They need to understand what's on the ballot and really do their homework about the unintended consequences sometimes that happens. And oftentimes, I think our society right now, as you can tell what's been happening over the last few years, that I think we have a society that's asleep at the wheel a little bit, and that are afraid to, maybe a little apathetic, feeling that, well, I'm not a social worker, I'm not a police officer. How am I supposed to stop human trafficking? Hasn't this been happening for centuries? Well, yes, it's been happening for centuries, but we must be active consumers. We must be active voters. We must educate ourselves about what's happening in our society and what that might look like. I'm kind of appalled when I talk to maybe other professionals, even our students, who say they don't vote because they don't feel empowered. They don't feel like their vote matters. And so I think people need to be involved, be aware what's happening, what's on the ballot, what does that really mean? We can't arrest our way out of this problem by no means, but we can become educated and put money into prevention programs where we are educating families, because I think through education, that's the only way out of this, is that we need a society that's more educated.
Annalisa?
I agree. And I also think that we have to look at this in context. So, when you are raising children that think that it is okay to buy and sell bodies, right? That this is the whole transactional piece. And this includes the demand side, right? This includes the buyers. We've seen like a huge shift in demand, where buyers are younger, where buyers say things, like in the kind of their exit interviews when they are caught, where they say things like, yeah, I don't want to deal with the relationships. I'd rather just pay for it and then be done. If we don't understand kind of both sides and keep saying, how do we work with these victims of trafficking, but never talk about perpetrators, we're not going to make a dent in what is happening. I think that we also have to support those people that are creating innovations that have the potential to make great change. We have an alumnus from our program who created, so simple, just by talking to survivors and victims, she found out like the one thing that they had in common was that their trafficker would leave them alone at least an hour a week to go get their nails done, because they still had to have this kind of aesthetic look. And during that hour of freedom, because they're getting sent there alone, is an opportunity for intervention. And one of our students, they created like this little sticker for their nails that's a QR code in this tiny sticker. So we know, like as Holly alluded to, it's not easy to leave. It's something like 7 or 8 times to get someone out of that sex trafficking loop. But when they are ready, they can scan that finger, and that QR code, if they don't trust authorities, can be registered to contact a loved one or someone that they trust to come get them, because those QR codes also have like a geotag in them. And it's,
Super cool.
Yeah.
Holly, I know, speaking of interventions, that you are one of the members of the LA Regional Human Trafficking Task Force. So I assume that this has a force for intervention. I mean, can you tell us a little bit about that experience and how that plays into these sorts of interventions that Annalisa was just telling us about?
When LA County Board of Supervisors started the first responder protocol, I attended many of their meetings as the prevention side, and I was the only school district representative for the whole state of California, for the whole LA County, that was at the table to talk about prevention, and that how we were incorporating it. Because when sitting around the table back in 2014, obviously it was very heavily law enforcement. Sheriff Jim McDonnell at the time, he was at the forefront of him and all the board of supervisors at the time. And slowly, the Department of Children and Family Services became the number one priority for children who were being identified, who were being trafficked, as the primary lead. So there's a first responder protocol right now that has been in effect since about 2014, where there's reports that you can pull it up on the internet as well. But there's a protocol on how, when a person has been identified, and what we're speaking about is the sex trafficking, not technically the labor trafficking part of it. But when a victim has been identified, there's a protocol that within 72 hours, the person has a medical exam, they go through a variety of screenings and interviews, and then a team approach where they are determining what's the safety protocols for this person. So it's been, I'm really proud to have been a part of that conversation. When I left LA Unified School District in 2016 to join USC, My shift kind of changed a little bit because I was no longer in the school district, but now my shift is really a little broader in that I'm able to support school districts in the nation around what can we do in the school system to have early identification, early prevention, and intervention protocols. So that's kind of my work right now, is really kind of honing in on schools, because that is kind of the epicenter of where educational, movements can happen, is in the schools, which we obviously know has had its share of problems in the last couple of years. So hopefully that helps to answer a little bit of that.
Oh, absolutely. Go ahead, Annalisa. Go ahead.
I think that we have to be able to look at this from all of these multiple fronts. And when Holly said, looking at through this lens of like, what can we do, like within large school organizations, districts, and bigger, is also like what whole industries have done, right? So what the hoteling industry is doing, all the way from creating, like, everybody wants to take a selfie in their hotel room. And so we have some like great tech people that created this database so that when a kid goes missing, they can match that picture up to like all these different selfies that are being taken if they're registered in this database, to say, oh, it's pretty likely they're on that hotel, on Figueroa at blah blah blah. And the airline industries, now you go into like the airports, and in bathroom stalls, there's definitions of what human trafficking is, for labor and for sex. And I think so at these big macro levels, right? Holly's talked
Mhm.
very much about policy, but also looking at like, how do we get our systems engaged? And then I also think about it like on these like micro levels, looking at some of the coolest things that I've ever heard in terms of combating traffic have been because, again, people feel empowered by being educated on what this is, and on being able to see the signs, and on listening to each other, and kind of going with your gut, like being brave. I know that sounds so
Yeah. No, being brave
cliche,
is so
right? But
important. I mean, this topic is so vast. I feel bad that we only have about a half an hour to talk, because I feel like we have hardly gotten started, and the time has run away. I think clearly there's a need for us to come and talk more about this, because I think there's so many more nuanced pieces of this, and the interventions are so challenging, but also the need for innovation is so great. I want to make sure that before we wrap up, give you each a moment for a minute or so, if there's something else that you really feel like, for our listeners that are maybe hearing about this topic from a social work angle for the first time, something that you want to share with them. Maybe I will turn first to Annalisa, and then I'll turn to Holly. Annalisa, what would you like to leave our listeners thinking about?
I think we're living in times of great fear, and it's caused a lot of immobility, like people not knowing what to do or if what they do matters. Having worked so closely with trafficking survivors and victims, I want to say that any little thing we do matters. And because you've given me permission, Eric, to say be brave, that it is not a cliche, I think, in this sense. I've seen 5-year-old girls be able to identify labor trafficking in their neighborhoods and successfully helped stop it. And I've seen fathers at slumber parties who are brave enough to say, why does your phone keep dinging? Who is messaging you? And then have been able to identify, this is someone who is grooming these little girls. We have to be willing to be there for each other and to speak up when we see something that we know in our gut is wrong. And I would rather be wrong about it than be right about it and not say anything. And so I think that hidden in plain sight, that Holly has mentioned, that it is happening all around us, and to really challenge things that have been normalized that should not have been, are things that we have to do if we want to make a dent in these trafficking numbers that you started with.
Beautiful. Thank you, Annalisa. Holly?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. And I think my first appeal is, what I want is, if someone is listening right now who may be in the life right now, who is being trafficked, but may not have seen themselves or called themselves a victim. If you're listening right now, I want you to know that there's help, that this is not okay. There's people that care about you and that there are resources. And so I just want also families to, talk to your young children, talk to them, help them understand, communicate with them. Don't fear the internet. Don't fear schools and partnering with public schools. I think public schools are a great resource for families. As much as you feel like, oh, my voice doesn't matter, your voice matters. It matters when you look the other way. If you're on a train or a plane or wherever you are, and you see something that feels a little weird to you, that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, that's something that's telling you to pay attention. So even as simple as just speaking up and giving eye contact and kind of disrupting something that may be happening, who knows? And oftentimes these victims are uncovered, or the victimization is uncovered because the simple act of an ordinary human being who came into contact to say, hello, are you okay? Is there somebody I can call for you? So thank you, Eric. Thank you, Annalisa, for your time.
Well, and thank you, Holly.
Yeah.
That was amazing. I feel embarrassed to try to even follow that up, but I will say it has been amazing to have the two of you here speaking with so much passion and so much dedication, right? That this is something that needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed with bravery, as you say, Annalisa. And thank you for a little bit of a playbook for that bravery, Holly, there at the end. I want to thank you both so much for joining me today. And I will say to our listeners, if you want to learn more about our work around human trafficking, you can visit our school's website, dworak-peck.usc.edu. If you have questions for the guests or our show, or you want to support our transformative research and education programs, please email us at listenuppeople@usc.edu. And one more time, Holly, Annalisa, amazing to have you both here, and thank you so much.
Thank you
for having us.